In the vast, glittering halls of the Valoran Empire's palace, an air of tense anticipation lingered. The Grand Council had convened, and today was a day unlike any other. The throne room, adorned with crystalline walls and gleaming alien symbols, had been packed to the brim with dignitaries, nobles, and representatives of dozens of worlds. But the true spectacle was not just the grandeur of the surroundings. It was the long-anticipated engagement ceremony of Princess Zalyra, the heir to the Valoran throne. This was supposed to be a moment of celebration, a union between the powerful Valoran Empire and the distant Terran Confederacy. The princess stood at the front, poised and regal in her elaborate gown of silver-threaded fabric that seemed to shimmer with every movement. Her lavender eyes, calm and knowing, scanned the room, resting momentarily on the various faces around her. At her side stood Prince Xanter, a tall, imposing figure with a golden crown resting upon his brow. He was known throughout the galaxy as a fierce military tactician, and his alliance with Zalyra's family was seen as the key to maintaining the Empire's dominance. The air hummed with murmurs, whispers of the soon-to-be-announced bond between the two great houses. However, no one could have predicted the disruption that would occur. With the grand doors of the throne room swung open, a rush of cold air entered the space. All eyes turned as a figure, one none in the room had expected, strode into the hall. His boots clicked sharply on the polished floor, breaking the uneasy silence that had begun to creep over the gathering. His features were unmistakably human, yet there was something undeniably different about him. His confidence, the almost palpable aura of command that seemed to emanate from his very presence. He was Captain Cole Hawk of the Terran Navy, the very same Terran Confederacy that had sent the emissaries to negotiate the union between the princess and Prince Xanter. His uniform was sleek and black, adorned with the symbols of his rank, but it wasn't the attire that caught everyone's attention. It was his reputation. Captain Hawk had made a name for himself across the stars, not just as a military leader but as a man who had fought in some of the most dangerous conflicts in human history. His encounters with aliens had left many in the galaxy wary of his unpredictability. The room fell deathly silent. Zalyra's heart skipped a beat as she recognized the captain. Though their paths had never crossed before, she had heard the rumors, the stories of his exploits and his unrelenting nature. There was a flicker of intrigue in her eyes, and she straightened her posture, her gaze never wavering from Hawk's approach. Prince Xanter, however, was not so composed. His grip on Zalyra's arm tightened, his eyes narrowing as he studied the human intruder. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to echo in the grand hall. "This is a matter of the Valoran Empire, not some Terran rogue. Leave at once, Captain." Captain Hawk did not flinch. He was a man who had faced down entire alien armies and came out victorious. With a slight smirk, he approached the royal couple, his voice low but clear. "I'm not here to disrupt anything, Prince Xanter," he said, his tone laced with a subtle but unmistakable confidence. "I'm here for the princess. There's something I need to discuss with her. Alone." The prince's face reddened with fury, but before he could retort, Hawk's eyes met Zalyra's. The princess hesitated for a moment, her thoughts racing. What could this human possibly want with her? She had heard whispers of the captain's boldness, but now, in the heat of the moment, she found herself intrigued, even somewhat unsettled. There was something about him, something that commanded respect, even in a place as prestigious as the Valoran throne room. Zalyra glanced at her father, King Vala, who sat high upon his golden throne, his expression unreadable. The king's gaze met hers, and she saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, a rare thing, especially for a ruler as powerful as he. The king had long held authority over the empire, but now, it seemed, even he was unsure of how to handle this sudden human incursion. For a brief moment, Zalyra felt the weight of the galaxy on her shoulders. Her father's empire was vast. Her arranged marriage to Prince Xanter was a political maneuver to ensure peace and prosperity. But in that instant, a sense of freedom surged within her, a glimmer of possibility she had never before dared to entertain. "Captain Hawk," she said, her voice soft but steady. "What is it that you want?" Hawk took a step forward, his eyes locking with hers, his presence all-consuming. "What I want," he said slowly, "is simple. I'm here to claim what's rightfully mine." The room erupted in gasps. Even the king looked momentarily taken aback. Zalaira's eyes widened, but she didn't step back. The human's words rang in her ears, an unexpected challenge to her carefully laid plans. But there was something in the way he spoke, something that made her pulse race with curiosity. She knew, deep down, that this moment would change everything. Her marriage, her future, all of it. It all hung in the balance. But in that split second, she could feel the weight of fate settling upon her shoulders. Captain Cole Hawk had come here for something more than just a political alliance. What that something was, however, was something the princess could only guess. And as the tension in the room thickened, Zalaira realized that this was only the beginning of a story far more complex than she could have ever imagined. The throne room was thick with tension. The grandeur of the hall, the polished stone, the alien tapestries. Everything seemed to lose its meaning in the wake of Captain Hawk's words. Princess Zalaira stood at the center of it all, frozen for just a moment, her mind racing as the full weight of the captain's challenge settled on her. His declaration wasn't one of mere conquest, it was a promise, something far deeper, far more intimate than the casual politics of the empire. "Claim what's yours," Xanter sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. He was already taking a step forward, his posture rigid with fury. "You must be joking, human. You think you can just waltz in here and—" "Silence!" King Vala's voice, deep and powerful, cut through the tension like a blade. His golden crown gleamed in the dim light of the throne room as his piercing eyes fixed on Xanter, who immediately halted in place, bowing his head slightly in reluctant submission. The king's gaze shifted to Hawk, cold and calculating. "You, Captain Hawk, are very bold, but you have not answered my question. What do you mean by claiming my daughter?" Zalaira's heart pounded in her chest as she looked at her father. The king's voice had always carried authority, but in that moment, his uncertainty was palpable. The king of the Valoran Empire, the ruler of thousands of worlds, was caught off guard by the very presence of this human. And it wasn't just the king. Every noble in the room, every diplomat, every courtier, was hanging on the edge of their seats, waiting for the next move. Captain Hawk stood tall, unflinching. There was something in his eyes, something dangerous and irresistible, that made Zalaira feel both uneasy and strangely drawn to him. "What I mean, Your Majesty," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "is that I've come to claim the princess as my own, not as a subject of an empire, not as a political asset, but as something far more personal." A hush fell over the room as the full weight of his words settled in. The king's expression darkened. "You speak as if you have the right to make such a demand," he said, his voice laced with anger. "Do you understand who you're speaking to? I will not stand for such insolence." Zalaira felt a chill run down her spine at the way her father spoke, his authority undeniable but challenged in a way she had never witnessed. There was no mistaking the implication of Hawk's words. He wasn't here for political gain, nor for an alliance. He was here for her. The very thought unsettled her. Yet, in a strange way, she couldn't deny that a flicker of excitement burned in her chest. "You misunderstand me, Your Majesty," Hawk replied, his tone shifting slightly. "I'm not here to offer an insult. I'm here to offer her a choice. You see, Princess," he turned his gaze to Zalaira, his intense stare locking with hers. "I'm not like the men you've been promised to, or the worlds you've been told to rule. I'm not asking you to be my ally. I'm asking you to be my equal." Zalaira's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Not her father, not her suitor, not anyone. The very idea of being an equal, of standing beside someone on her own terms, was almost alien to her. She was the heir to the Valoran throne, and for all her training, for all her duties, she had always been treated as something to be protected, something to be controlled. But here was a human, a Terran, who saw her not as a princess, but as a person. The princess swallowed, unsure of what to say, unsure of what to think. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, caught between the expectations of her father, the weight of duty, and the strange pull of Hawk's confidence. It was a pull she couldn't explain, but one that was growing stronger with every passing second. The captain's gaze softened for the briefest moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "I've seen the way you look at this life, princess. I've seen the way you've been groomed to be a symbol, a figurehead for your people. But you don't have to be that. You have more power than they realize." Prince Xanter, who had been seething with rage, took a step forward, his hand instinctively moving toward the hilt of his blade. "Enough of this," he growled. "You'll pay for your insolence, human. You think you can just waltz in and take what is mine? I will not stand for it." Zalaira instinctively stepped back, her gaze darting from the prince to Hawk. She could feel the tension crackling in the air, and she knew that the next few moments would decide everything. But to her surprise, it wasn't Hawk who responded first. It was the king, his voice cutting through the escalating chaos with chilling finality. "Xanter," King Vala said, his voice low and dangerous, "hold your temper." The prince's face twisted in disbelief. "Father, how can you allow this human to—" "Enough," the king repeated, his tone brokering no argument. "You forget yourself. This is not about your pride. It is about the fate of the empire. And right now, Captain Hawk's presence here is something I did not foresee. But I will not allow my daughter to be forced into any decision, not even by me." The room went silent, save for the low hum of the distant stars outside the palace windows. Zalaira's eyes flicked from the king to the captain, her heart racing. What was happening? Had her father just sided with the human? Had she been given permission to make her own choice? In that moment, something shifted within her. The weight of her father's words, the unexpected support from the king. It all opened a door that had been locked tight for years. She could feel the power of her own autonomy, and it filled her with both fear and exhilaration. Captain Hawk was still standing tall, his gaze unwavering as he waited for her response. Zalaira looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. This wasn't a man trying to claim her as a possession. He wasn't here for a political alliance. He was here because, somehow, he had seen her for what she truly was. The princess inhaled slowly, her decision settling into her heart like a weightless truth. "I'm not some prize to be won," she said, her voice steady as she met Hawk's eyes. "But I am willing to hear what you have to say." The entire room went still, and Captain Hawk gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable. It had only just begun. The air in the grand hall was heavy, saturated with the weight of history, politics, and a challenge that could reshape the fate of the Valoran Empire. Zalaira's declaration echoed in the silence that followed, and all eyes were on her, waiting for her next move. The nobles, the diplomats, even the guards standing stoically along the walls, seemed to hold their breath. The captain's expression was unreadable, his dark eyes fixed solely on Zalaira, as though she were the only person in the room. In that moment, it wasn't the political intrigue or the powerful alliances that mattered. It was her decision. Zalaira could feel the entire weight of the universe pressing in on her shoulders. Yet she had never felt more alive, more empowered. Prince Xanter, still seething with indignation, opened his mouth to protest, but Zalaira raised her hand, silencing him instantly. Her father, the king, didn't intervene. He simply watched, his ancient gaze filled with a mixture of curiosity and something else, something far more difficult to read. Zalaira met the captain's gaze once more, the pull of his presence undeniable. "What do you offer me, Captain Hawk? You speak of equality, of freedom. But what does that mean in your world, in your galaxy?" Hawk's lips twitched into a smile, though it was a smile that was devoid of arrogance or mockery. There was an understanding in it, an acknowledgement of the unspoken burden she carried. "It means you choose your own path, princess. Not your father. Not your betrothed. You—" Zalaira's heart thudded in her chest as the magnitude of those words settled in. She had been born to rule, to uphold the Valoran legacy, a legacy built on political alliances and calculated marriages. She had never been asked what she wanted, what she dreamed of, what she believed in. Every decision had been made for her, every step of her life mapped out by others. Until now. What would that look like, in your world? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes never left Hawk's. I can't promise you a life of luxury, he replied, his tone raw with honesty. But I can promise you a life of your own making. A life where you're not just a figurehead, but a person who chooses the direction of their future. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. If you want to stay here, in this gilded cage with Prince Xanter and the Empire, you can. But if you want something else, something real, then you have a choice. Zalaira's thoughts spun, her gaze flickering between Hawk and her father. The room had grown quiet, waiting for her to make a choice. The king's eyes remained neutral, but Zalaira could feel the pressure of his expectations, the weight of her duty to the Empire. But there was something else, something deeper than duty that called to her now. It was the possibility of freedom, of being seen as more than a political pawn. A life where her choices weren't predetermined. A life where she could stand beside someone who didn't see her as a symbol but as an equal. Her mind raced. Was this possible? Could she truly walk away from everything she had ever known? From her father's empire, from Prince Xanter, from the chains that bound her to a future she never wanted? I'm not asking for a life of luxury, Hawk continued, his voice gentle, but his words were laced with conviction. I'm asking for the chance to fight beside you, not just for you. Zalaira felt a stirring in her chest, a spark of something long buried, a desire for agency, for choice. The life she had always known suddenly felt suffocating, oppressive. And in front of her stood a man who offered her something she had never even dared to dream of. Autonomy. Partnership, not a possession. She turned to look at her father, King Vala, who had not moved from his throne. His gaze was unreadable, his features set in a mask of regal composure. He had been her guide, her protector, the pillar on which the Empire had stood. But was he truly the protector of her spirit, or just her future as a political tool? Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, simmering growl from Xanter, who had finally managed to regain some semblance of composure. You would betray your empire? Your people? He spat, his voice venomous. You would choose him over the stability of the entire galaxy? Zalaira's lips parted, ready to respond, but it was her father's voice that came first, cold and deliberate. Do not speak of betrayal, Xanter, King Vala said, his eyes now fixed firmly on the prince. It is not betrayal for a daughter to choose her own path, regardless of what is expected of her. Xanter flinched, taken aback by the king's unexpected support of his daughter's autonomy. But, Your Majesty, he stammered, clearly unprepared for such an open declaration. Your daughter is the future of this empire. Without her, the Valoran throne would fall to ruin. That may be true, the king replied, his voice soft but laced with finality. But Zalaira's path cannot be dictated by fear of the unknown. Her choices are hers to make, and I will not stand in her way. The words hung in the air like an unspoken command, and for a long moment, Xanter seemed to shrink under the weight of the king's authority. He bowed his head, clearly defeated, but not without a seething anger that threatened to boil over. Zalaira's heart raced. She had never expected this kind of support from her father. It was a dangerous thing, an act of defiance that could have consequences far beyond anything she could predict. But for the first time in her life, she felt a sense of freedom, a glimpse of a life beyond the walls of the throne room. She turned back to Captain Hawk, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. If I choose this path, what happens next? Hawk's lips curved into a small, approving smile. You'll leave this palace, this empire, and we'll forge a new future. Together, the clarity of his words struck Zalaira like a thunderclap. There would be no turning back. This was not a decision that could be undone. There was no halfway, no easy return to her old life. Her eyes searched his, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a princess. She felt like a person with agency, with the power to choose her own future. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, and yet, she felt lighter than she had in years. I choose you, she said, her voice steady but filled with something new, something undeniable. The captain's smile widened, but he said nothing. Instead, he simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the choice she had made. And in that moment, the fate of the empire of the Valoran throne was sealed, not by the king's decree, not by the expectations of her birth, but by Zelira's own will. This was only the beginning. Zelira's heart beat wildly in her chest, a mix of excitement and fear surging through her veins. She had chosen. There was no going back. The weight of her decision, one that would change the trajectory of not only her life but the fate of the Valoran Empire, was profound. Yet for the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of relief. The walls of the palace, once symbols of protection and power, now felt like an uninviting prison. Her eyes met Hawk's once more, and this time, she saw something in his gaze, a flicker of admiration. He hadn't expected her to say yes. There was no arrogance in his posture, no sense of triumph, only quiet respect for the decision she had made. Behind them, the room had remained utterly still. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. The nobles were still in shock, the politicians still digesting the weight of what had just occurred. But Zelira was no longer concerned with them. She was no longer concerned with her father's empire, or Prince Xanter, whose stunned silence spoke volumes. King Vala's eyes flickered toward his daughter, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Zelira saw him not as the unyielding ruler of the Valoran Empire, but as a father who had just lost control of the one thing he had cherished most, his daughter. The king did not speak immediately. Instead, he regarded Zelira for a long moment, his gaze piercing and full of silent thoughts. The tension in the room was palpable, but Zelira held her ground. She was no longer the helpless heir, the delicate princess waiting to be married off for the good of the empire. She was something new, something entirely different, something free. Finally, the king spoke, his voice low and controlled. You have made your choice, Zelira. It is your life to live. He paused, then added with an edge of bitterness, but know this will not be without consequence. The empire may not forgive you for this. Zelira's throat tightened, but she didn't waver. I am not here to seek their forgiveness, father, she said softly. I'm here to choose my own destiny. With that, the silence that had held the room in a stranglehold broke. The nobles began to whisper among themselves, their voices a mix of disbelief, curiosity, and growing concern. Xanter, his pride wounded, could barely contain his fury. You have condemned the empire, he spat at Zelira, stepping forward with clenched fists. This will not go unpunished. You think you can just walk away from your responsibilities? You think you can just abandon us for some human? His voice was like ice, yet the venom laced within it was unmistakable. Zelira's gaze never left Xanter's. She knew what he was trying to do. He was attempting to guilt her, to remind her of her duty. But it didn't work. She had been bound by duty all her life. It was time for something else. Your empire, she said, her voice gaining strength, is built on the backs of those who were never asked what they wanted. I refuse to be another piece on your chessboard, Xanter. I will not be your pawn. The prince's face twisted in rage, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the throne room, the doors slamming behind him. The sound echoed through the palace, signaling the end of an era. Once the prince had left, the king spoke again, his voice heavy with resignation. Go then, Zelira. Go with him. You are no longer the heir to this throne. The Valoran Empire will continue without you. Zelira's heart clenched at the finality in her father's words, but she didn't let it show. She had made her choice, and she would not turn back now. Turning toward Hawk, she saw him watching her with a steady gaze, as though waiting for her to be certain of her decision. There was no judgment, no impatience, just quiet understanding. I'm ready, she said simply, her voice firm. Hawk gave a brief nod, his lips curling into a faint smile. Then let's go. The two of them turned toward the grand doors of the throne room, leaving the empire, the politics, and the gilded chains of royalty behind. As they crossed the threshold, Zalyra felt a deep sense of finality. The doors closed with a soft echo, and the vast expanse of the Valoran palace faded away. For the first time in her life, she was free. The journey from the palace to the ship awaiting them in the lower hangar bay was swift but filled with an odd sense of surrealness. Zalyra walked beside Captain Hawk, her feet light, but her mind racing. What would the future hold? The Empire, her birthright, had already begun to move forward without her, its wheels turning with relentless speed. Would she regret this choice? Could she truly walk away from everything she had ever known? She glanced up at Hawk, who was walking beside her, his pace steady and unhurried. There was a sense of confidence in him, a calm that Zalyra envied. He wasn't worried about what came next. He knew what he wanted, and it was clear he wasn't going to let anything stand in his way. And perhaps that was the key to understanding her choice. Hawk was someone who acted without hesitation, who didn't allow others to dictate his future. He forged his own path, no matter the consequences. Zalyra had always lived under the shadow of expectations, but now, for the first time, she felt like she could do the same. The hangar bay was filled with the soft hum of machinery and the sounds of Terran engineers preparing Hawk's ship for departure. The vessel was sleek, its metallic exterior gleaming under the bright lights, a testament to Terran ingenuity. Zalyra had seen ships of many kinds in her lifetime, Grand Valoran ships, military cruisers, and diplomatic transports. But none of them felt as alive, as ready for the unknown, as Hawk's vessel did. She stopped in front of the ship's open hatch and looked back toward the palace one last time. The towering walls of the Valoran Empire loomed in the distance, its spires reaching for the sky. A sense of finality washed over her, but with it, there was something else, a feeling of freedom, of possibility. Hawk turned to face her, a gentle smile playing on his lips. This is the beginning of something new, Zalyra. We make our own rules now. Zalyra met his gaze, and for the first time, she felt like she was truly seeing him. Not just the captain, not just the human who had come to claim her, but the man who had given her the courage to take her future into her own hands. "I'm ready," she said again, her voice stronger this time, and with that they boarded the ship. The engines roared to life, and as the vessel ascended into the stars, Zalyra felt the last remnants of her past life fall away, leaving her with nothing but the endless horizon of possibility ahead. The road ahead would be anything but easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, and perhaps even enemies. But for the first time, Zalyra felt like she could face them all. The future was hers to command. The hum of the ship's engines was steady, the rhythmic thrum reverberating through Zalyra's chest as she leaned back into the plush seat, her eyes staring out at the vast expanse of space beyond the viewing window. The stars stretched out endlessly, an ocean of light, distant and cold. Yet for Zalyra, the sight was no longer daunting. It was liberating. She was free of the constraints of royalty, of the rigid path her father had set before her. For the first time in her life, she could make her own decisions. Beside her, Captain Hawk sat at the controls, his face illuminated by the soft blue glow of the ship's dashboard. He was effortlessly calm, his hands moving with practiced precision as he adjusted the ship's trajectory. The vessel hummed and swayed gently as it shifted through the stars, cutting through the vastness of space with ease. "How long until we reach the rendezvous point?" Zalyra asked, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. Hawk's gaze flicked over to her, his lips curling into a brief smile. "About an hour. We're headed to a neutral zone just outside of the cradle cluster. There's a ship waiting for us. A friend of mine. He's got a safe house there where we can lay low for a while." Zalyra nodded, her thoughts still swirling. The cradle cluster was a region of space known for its proximity to several hostile factions, a place where many ships could disappear without a trace. It was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the Valoran Empire, where everything was monitored, everything was accounted for. In the cluster, they would be nothing more than shadows, drifting in the void. As much as she was excited to leave her past behind, a part of her was still tethered to it. There were no guarantees out here, no allies, no assurances. Only the unknown. "You've been to places like this before?" she asked, her tone thoughtful. Once or twice, Hawk replied, his voice casual, though his eyes remained focused on the ship's instruments. More than enough to know how to navigate the more colorful parts of space. Zalaira chuckled lightly, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. She had never imagined herself in a position like this. The princess, the heir to an empire, fleeing into the unknown with a human captain as her sole companion. It was a strange twist of fate. But then again, wasn't that what she had wanted? To be more than just a political pawn, to break free from the shackles of expectation? We'll be fine, Zalaira, Hawk added, his voice taking on a more reassuring tone. You've got a good head on your shoulders. You'll get the hang of it out here. Zalaira's gaze shifted from the stars to him, her eyes narrowing slightly in thought. What makes you so sure? You don't even know me. Hawk gave her a quick look, his expression unreadable. Because I've seen it before, he said quietly, almost as if to himself. People like you, people with more power than they realize, who've been stifled by their own surroundings. You'll adapt. You won't just survive, you'll thrive. Zalaira felt a flutter of uncertainty in her chest. You think I'll be able to handle it? She asked, her voice softer now. Hawk turned toward her fully, meeting her gaze with an intensity that surprised her. I don't think. I know. He paused, his expression softening. But I also know that you've spent your entire life being told what to do, what to say, who to marry. This will be different. There will be hard decisions. And they'll be yours to make. Zalaira absorbed his words, his confidence in her strange but comforting. It was a far cry from the kind of assurances her father had given her, which were always tainted with the weight of his expectations. Hawk didn't just see her as a princess. He saw her as a person, someone capable of charting her own course. What happens when we get there? Zalaira asked, her mind already racing ahead to the next step. When we land, we'll meet with my contact, who's been in hiding for a while. He'll have information we can use to lay low. And I have a few leads on some unsavory types who may have been looking for you. So we need to be cautious. Zalaira tilted her head, intrigued. You think there are people after me? Hawk didn't look up from his controls but nodded slightly. Your family has made enemies, especially your father. People won't be happy about the way you left, and it's possible that some will come after you to make sure you don't upset the balance. The reality of her situation settled over her like a dark cloud. She had expected resistance, but she hadn't truly understood the depth of it. The Valoran Empire was vast, and as the daughter of its king, she had been at the center of countless political webs. The moment she stepped away from that world, she knew she would face opposition. But that didn't mean it would be easy. We'll handle it, Hawk continued, his voice steady. We've got time. The cradle cluster is a good place to disappear for a while. Zalaira leaned back in her seat, her thoughts spinning. She was no longer the sheltered princess in her father's palace. She was now part of something much larger, something that didn't have the safety nets of her former life. But with that came an exhilarating sense of possibility. The choices she made now, where they went, what they did, were entirely up to her. She wasn't defined by the Empire anymore. She was defined by herself. As the ship sailed further into the uncharted regions of space, Zalaira found herself growing more comfortable with the uncertainty. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing. For once, the future wasn't decided by anyone but her. Time passed quickly as the ship cut through the endless expanse of space, the stars blurring as they traveled faster than light. Soon, Zalaira began to feel a strange sense of anticipation, a sense that she was on the brink of something much larger than herself. There was a whole universe out there, full of danger, adventure, and perhaps even a new purpose for her life. For the first time, she wasn't burdened by expectations. The path ahead was not one of duty or political alliances. It was a path she would carve with her own hands. The ship's proximity alarms suddenly beeped, breaking Zalaira from her reverie. Hawk adjusted the controls, his eyes scanning the holographic display. We're almost there, he said, his voice now more serious. Get ready. Zalaira took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready. She had made her choice, and now there was no turning back. As the ship prepared to dock in the remote, shadowy corners of the cradle cluster, Zalaira couldn't help but wonder what awaited her. Would they find safety in the quiet depths of the cluster? Or would the enemies of her past soon come knocking? There was only one way to find out, and for the first time in her life, Zalaira felt alive with possibility. The ship's docking bay loomed ahead, a dark, industrial space nestled deep in the heart of the cradle cluster. The stars outside seemed distant, almost unreachable, as though the galaxy itself were holding its breath. The ship's engines hummed low, its sleek hull moving with precision toward the station that would be their sanctuary, or their grave. Zalaira stood by the viewport, watching the docking bay grow larger. She had expected the cradle cluster to be dark, a place of seclusion and secrets, but the reality of it was even more unnerving than she had imagined. The station they were heading toward was a patchwork of scavenged metal and hastily constructed structures, lit by flickering neon signs that illuminated the faces of those who called this place home. It was a world far removed from the luxury of the Valoran Empire, and yet, in its own way, it was a world of freedom. "How long do you think we'll stay here?" Zalaira asked, turning toward Hawk as he adjusted the ship's controls. His face was expressionless, focused as always, but there was a slight tension in the way he held his shoulders. "Not long," Hawk said. "Long enough to get some information, to restock, and then we'll keep moving. This is a transient place. No one stays for long unless they have no other choice. But it's perfect for laying low." Zalaira nodded, absorbing the information. It was clear to her that Hawk had seen places like this before, had lived in the shadows of society long enough to understand the danger they were in. Her life in the palace had been one of opulence and control, where everything had been ordered and structured. Now it was all chaos, uncertainty, and constant vigilance. But that was the price of freedom. As the ship's landing gear made contact with the station's platform, Zalaira felt the faintest jolt run through her body. The sudden stillness after the hum of the ship's engines left a ringing silence in the air. For a moment, she simply stood there, staring out into the vastness of space, her mind whirling with the enormity of everything that had happened, and everything that was yet to come. Hawk stood and stretched, his movements easy and fluid as he unstrapped himself from his seat. "Get ready," he said, his voice low but carrying an edge of command that Zalaira had learned to respect. "We'll be on the ground for a while, but we need to stay sharp. Stay close to me." Zalaira nodded, pushing herself to her feet. The sharp weight of her decision settled into her bones. She wasn't just the princess of the Valoran Empire anymore. She was an outlaw, a fugitive, running from the past that had always defined her. The reality of that was sobering, but there was a part of her that felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She had made her choice. There was no turning back now. The hatch of the ship opened with a soft hiss, and the cool, recycled air of the station hit Zalaira's face. She stepped down onto the metallic floor, her boots clicking against the worn surface. The place was alive with the hum of machinery, the clatter of voices in various languages, and the low growl of distant engines. It was the underbelly of the galaxy, a place where the powerful never ventured, and the powerless thrived in secrecy. Hawk led the way, his sharp eyes scanning the space as they moved through the maze of corridors. Zalaira followed closely, feeling out of place in the sea of ragged, hardened individuals that filled the station's narrow hallways. There were traders, smugglers, bounty hunters, all trying to make a living in a place where the law was a distant concept. They reached a small, dimly lit bar at the center of the station, the scent of alcohol and sweat thick in the air. The patrons barely looked up as Hawk and Zalaira entered, their eyes too focused on their own dealings or drinks to pay them any mind. The bartender, a lanky, unshaven man with a scar running down his cheek, gave Hawk a curt nod. "You got the package?" Hawk asked, his voice cool but unmistakably authoritative. The bartender wiped his hands on a rag and pointed toward a corner booth, where a hooded figure sat waiting. "He's been expecting you." Zalaira's pulse quickened as they approached. She had no idea who this person was, but it was clear that Hawk trusted him. She tried to keep her face neutral, but her mind raced. Who could possibly be involved in the kinds of deals Hawk was making? And what did they want with someone like her? The hooded figure didn't look up as they approached, his silhouette barely visible beneath the dim light. He remained completely still, as though he were expecting them. Hawk slid into the seat opposite the man without hesitation. "You have information for me?" Hawk asked, his tone firm, though there was a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. The man leaned forward, his face still hidden beneath his hood. "The princess is not just a prize," he said in a gravelly voice. "She's a symbol, a beacon for those who would seek to topple the Valoran throne." Zalyra felt the weight of the words. She knew her departure from the Empire would send ripples through the galaxy, but she hadn't fully considered the impact it might have. There were those who would see her as a threat, those who would use her as a pawn in their own schemes. The man's eyes gleamed from beneath the hood as he continued, "You're being hunted by more than just your father's people. There are factions out there who want to use you, and there are those who want to silence you before you become a rallying point for rebellion." Zalyra's heart clenched. She had suspected it, but hearing it from someone who clearly knew more than he was letting on made the danger feel immediate, tangible. This was no longer just a flight for freedom. This was survival. Hawk remained calm, his gaze unwavering. "Then we'll make sure they don't find her." The man nodded slowly, his lips curling into a small, dark smile. "It won't be that easy. You're in a place where the rules are different. And in the Cradle Cluster, there's always someone willing to sell out the weak for the right price." Zalyra looked at Hawk, seeing the faintest flicker of concern in his eyes. He was trying to keep his composure, but even he knew that the stakes had just escalated. The hunt for her had begun in earnest. "Thank you," Hawk said quietly to the man. "We'll keep a low profile for now." The man stood, his movements fluid and silent. "I hope you know what you're doing, because once you're on their radar, there's no going back." With that, the hooded figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving Zalyra and Hawk alone at the booth. The weight of the conversation settled heavily between them. Zalyra's life had just become infinitely more complicated. The danger was no longer distant. It was real, and it was closing in. But as she looked up at Hawk, her heart steeled itself. This was what freedom truly meant. The price was high, but she had already paid it. There was no turning back. "We'll be ready," Zalyra said, her voice low but resolute. Hawk nodded, his expression unwavering. "We're in this together, and we'll fight to the end." The world around them was dark and uncertain, but Zalyra had never been more certain of her own strength. The future was a battlefield, and she was ready to face it head-on.